Okay, let's get started. So hi everyone, and welcome to the final session of today. We're going to be concluding with our keynote speaker, and we could not be more honored or delighted to welcome the inimitable Brenda Davis, registered dietitian, internationally renowned speaker, author, vegan extraordinaire, and I know all of you are extremely excited. So since Brenda will be joining us on Zoom, please let's try to keep discussions during the session to a minimum so we have time for Q&A, especially as every single person attending the conference who's here is going to be in this room. So I'll hand over to you now, Brenda, and thank you again for being with us here today.
Oh, well, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for the beautiful introduction. It's just such a privilege to be with you today. My topic is protein and nutrition essentials for older adults, and I have no potential conflicts of interest. Let's start with a brief overview. Today, we're going to talk first about some of the unique nutrition challenges of older adults. And then we'll spend most of our time talking about the top nutrition priorities and the relative impacts of plant-based diets. And the nutrition priorities are number one, to prevent chronic diseases, number two, to delay age-related conditions, and number three, to avoid malnutrition. So let's begin with the unique nutrition challenges of older adults. You know, when we think about nutritionally vulnerable groups, the conversation often steers towards pregnant and lactating women and, of course, infants and children. And older adults are so often overlooked, but in fact, they may be the single largest nutritionally vulnerable demographic. And their risk may increase due to declines in physiological function, changes in the social determinants of health, and poor nutrition. And so let's look at some of the potential declines in physiological function. First, of course, there are changes in the gastrointestinal tract, decreased acid secretion, reduced digestive enzyme production, lower supply of blood to the stomach mucosa, reduced gastric motility, constipation, and of course, metabolism decreases. There are declines in oral health, swallowing difficulties, changes in body composition, particularly loss of muscle mass and bone, reduced appetite, sensory function deficits, changes in fluid and electrolyte regulation, and then of course, chronic illnesses, infections, and inflammation, and cognitive decline. And then there are often changes in the social determinants of health. We commonly see greater financial insecurity, food insecurity. There are changes in housing, lack of basic amenities, altered surroundings, and social isolation and discrimination, loneliness and depression, hospitalization, and a reduced access often to health services, and for many, a diminished ability to shop and prepare food. And then, of course, we see poor nutrition, including inadequate or excessive caloric intakes, inadequate intakes or absorption of macro and micronutrients, suboptimal intakes of fiber, and poor quality diets, lower intakes of vegetables, fruits, and other whole plant foods, and excessive intakes of highly processed foods with added fat, salt, and sugar, fried foods, fast foods, and excessive intakes of meat and other animal products that are rich in saturated fat. So let's move on to look at some of the nutritional priorities for older adults. And of course, the goal here being to increase health span. Lifespan, of course, is the number of years we live, whereas health span is the number of years we enjoy a high quality of life free of disease. It's really about adding joyful, healthful, functional, and vibrant years to our lives. So nutritional priority number one is to prevent chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, cancers, respiratory diseases, and cognitive disorders. And what many people don't realize is that these chronic diseases are actually responsible for 74% of all deaths globally. In the United States, nearly 95% of older adults have at least one chronic condition, and nearly 80% have two or more. So how do plant-based eaters fare? Well, this is the last presentation of VegMed, and I think you've heard multiple evidence-based presentations that established chronic disease risk reduction in those eating healthy, whole food, plant-based diets. And you may be very familiar with some of the studies that have followed similar health conscious individuals eating different dietary patterns over many years, including EPIC Oxford and the Adventist Health Study too. And when you look at the results comparing these individuals, what we consistently see is reduced risk in plant-based eaters. And we see for mortality, ischemic heart disease, and cancer, somewhat lower risk. But for hypertension, diabetes, and diverticular disease, we see a markedly lower risk, particularly for vegans, 75% for hypertension, 62% for diabetes, 72% for diverticular disease. And we see also very significant risk reduction for kidney disease and cataracts. So why this advantage? Well, I think it really boils down to this. Plant-based dietary patterns maximize protective dietary components, such as fiber, phytochemicals, antioxidants, plant sterols, and pre and probiotics. And they minimize potentially pathogenic dietary components, such as saturated fat, trans fatty acids, refined carbohydrates, the pro-inflammatory molecule in meat, NU5GC, TMAO and its precursors, chemical contaminants, pro-oxidants, and endotoxins, which are found mainly in two categories of foods, animal products and highly processed foods. Nutritional priority number 2 is to delay age-related chronic conditions such as sarcopenia, osteoporosis, and frailty. So first, sarcopenia. Sarcopenia is essentially age-related involuntary loss of skeletal muscle mass and strength, with up to 50% of mass being lost by the 8th decade of life. And the prevalence in older adults ranges from about 10 to 87%, of course, depending on age, with increasing rates as we get older. And protein is the nutrient that's commonly associated with sarcopenia. The USN Haynes study, up to 46% of the elderly population did not reach the protein intake recommended for adults. And this is 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight in the United States. So how much protein is actually needed? Well, many experts believe that older adults need protein intakes above the typical adult recommended intakes in order to avoid muscle loss and sarcopenia. And while many countries don't have separate recommendations for older adults, a growing number of countries do. And you can see here, the first 4 nations or groups don't have separate recommendations for older adults. And this includes the UK, the US, the European Food Safety Authority, and China. And you can see the recommended protein intakes range from 0.75 grams per kilogram per day in the UK up to 1 gram per kilogram per day in China. But there are several nations that do have higher recommended intakes, including Australia. And these are all of the nations in red here. But Australia, at 1 gram per kilogram per day on average, they recommend a little more for men than for women. But these recommendations are for adults 70 plus, and they are 25% higher than they are for those under 70 years of age. And then Germany, Austria, and Switzerland recommend 1 gram per kilogram per day for individuals over 65, and that's 20% higher than for those under 65. And then in the Nordic countries, they actually recommend 1.2 to 1.5 grams per kilogram per day, which is much higher than what they recommend for those under 65 at 0.83 grams per kilogram per day. And then there are also a number of scientific groups and position papers that also recommend higher intakes for older adults. And the first is one from Australia. They recommend for older adults over 65, 1 to 1.3 grams per kilogram per day. For active older adults, at least 1.2 grams per kilogram per day. And for older adults with acute or chronic disease, 1.2 to 1.5 grams per kilogram per day. And then ESPN, or the European Society for Clinical Nutrition and Metabolism, also recommends 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram per day in healthy older adults over 65, and 1.2 to 1.5 for those with malnutrition or at risk due to acute or chronic illness. And then SCEO Task Force recommended 1 to 1.2 for postmenopausal women. And then the Protege study group also recommended for those over 65, 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram. And then for active older adults, at least 1.2 grams per kilogram per day. And then older adults with chronic disease, 1.2 to 1.5. And the bottom line is consensus is building that the protein needs of healthy older adults are probably about 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram per day, and possibly more for those with sarcopenia, acute or chronic illness. So why might older adults actually need more protein? Well, it's because they have a diminished capacity to digest protein, a reduced ability to break down food in the mouth due to lower bite force, poor dentition, and less saliva, reduced ability to break down proteins into amino acids due to lower production of gastric acid and pepsin, and then a reduced ability to absorb amino acids due to changes in pancreatic secretions and the lining of the intestinal tract. And then, of course, there's also anabolic resistance to protein ingestion, which makes it harder to build and retain muscle in older adults. Now, because of all of this, these higher recommendations and the concerns about the ability to maintain muscle mass in our latter years, there was a publication in 2022 that actually suggested vegan diets may not be appropriate for older adults because of the risk of inadequate protein intake and plant foods having a lower protein density and suboptimal essential amino acid content, and isolated plant proteins having an inferior protein quality. And they also mentioned increasing portion sizes to compensate for the lower anabolic properties of vegan meals is not realistic for many older adults, and that the current strategies to improve the anabolic properties of plant-based foods are not feasible for many older adults. And vegan meals lead to higher rates of satiation and reduced energy intake. And exchanging omnivorous portions for similar portions of plant-based foods will reduce daily protein intake and increase risk of sarcopenia. And of course, I beg to differ. I don't agree with the findings of this particular report. And I think we do need to be prepared to speak to these accusations. So I want to provide a few studies that would suggest otherwise. So first, in 2020, there was a review, Fighting Sarcopenia in Aging European Adults. And this was almost 1,000 individuals, 65 to 79 years. And they compared protein intakes ranging from less than 8 grams per kilogram per day to greater than 1.2 grams per kilogram per day. And they examined sarcopenia risk score. And what they found, which is fairly predictable, is that the greatest risk occurred in people consuming less than 8 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. There was still an increased risk at 0.8 to 1 gram per kilogram. There was a decreased risk at 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram body weight. And the greatest reduction was in those consuming more than 1.2 grams per kilogram. But here is the surprise. An isocaloric substitution of animal-based protein with plant-based protein reduced sarcopenia risk across all levels of protein intake. So it was plant-based protein that was most protective. And the authors also mentioned that plant-derived proteins are related to faster walking speed and higher scores for physical performance. Another study looking at muscle mass in Taiwanese elderly, this was 327 community dwelling individuals, and they also found participants in the lowest quartile of total protein intake, and that was at about 13.2% of calories, had 3 times a greater risk of low muscle mass compared to those with the highest quartile of protein intake, or 17.2% of calories. And protein intake in this cohort was about half from plant sources and half from animal sources, which of course is much more plant protein than what we see in most Western populations. But vegetable protein intake was strongly associated with reduced risk of low muscle mass. Those in the lowest those with the lowest vegetable protein intake had over double the risk, 2.3 times the risk of low muscle mass. And we also have a couple of studies that I think are quite interesting. They're outliers. They reported increased risk with higher protein intakes. And the first being the Newcastle 85 plus study. So this is community living adults, at least 85 years of age, who consumed a traditional British diet that was high in butter, red meat, meat dishes, gravy, potatoes, vegetables, sweets, and desserts. They had a 2.4-fold increased risk of sarcopenia compared with those consuming more prudent low butter diet, even when their protein intakes were higher. And adherence to dietary patterns high in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, fish, and eggs were associated with stronger grip and faster performance compared to those high in red or processed meat and butter. And what the authors concluded is that high protein intake may not be sufficient to protect against sarcopenia if the diet quality is low. And then the second study was the British twin study that reported significantly higher risk of sarcopenia with protein intakes greater than 1.3 grams per kilogram compared to those consuming less than 1 gram per kilogram. However, almost 99% of participants consumed less than 20% of their protein from plant sources. So the authors suggested that the results are specific to those consuming high animal source protein intakes. And they also offered some possible explanations for this. High animal protein intakes are acidogenic and can lead to mild metabolic acidosis with detrimental effects on muscle mass. And high animal protein intakes may negatively affect the gut microbiome and adversely impact muscle strength. And the other possibility they suggested is the association may be due to those individuals with sarcopenia deliberately consuming more protein to ameliorate muscle loss. So is sarcopenia inevitable in older adults? The answer is no. Although some muscle loss is associated with natural aging process, sarcopenia can be avoided with regular weight-bearing exercise and a high-quality, nutritious diet with sufficient protein and essential nutrients. And I just want to share a little bit of my own personal clinical experience. I've worked with several whole food plant-based older adults, and these are particularly women who were consuming around 35 to 40 grams of protein per day. And many of these individuals were concerned about their protein because in the plant-based community, the mantra is if you eat enough calories from a variety of foods, you get enough protein. And while this is generally true, older adults have higher protein needs and lower energy intakes. So getting enough protein can be more challenging for this demographic. And some of the signs of inadequate protein intake that we can see are skin fragility, hair loss, brittle nails, muscle weakness, fatigue, inability to fight infection, poor wound healing, longer recovery times, and mood changes. And I just want to share a testimony from a client who had low protein intakes. And she says, I was frustrated by many symptoms after following a whole food plant-based diet for some time. I wondered if I was getting enough protein, but the plant-based doctors I was following told me that protein was not the issue. I sent an email to Brenda Davis, and she assessed my diet and suggested increasing my protein intake from about 35 to 40 grams a day to about 60 to 70 grams a day. I feel better and look better. My skin is vastly improved on increased protein. No Band-Aids, no bleeding, more opaque, and much less bruising. My abdomen is receding. These are issues I've dealt with since my mid-70s, and now at 83 years of age, they're clearing up. I think it's really important that older adults know that even on healthy, whole food, plant-based diets, protein can fall short, and increasing protein intake can be very helpful. So what are the targets? 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram a day, which means for most people about 20 to 30 grams of protein per meal if they're consuming 3 meals a day. So for someone whose healthy body weight is 60 kilograms, they would be looking at 60 to 72 grams. For someone whose healthy body weight is 80 kilograms, it would be 80 to 96 grams of protein. Moving on to osteoporosis, there was a review of 40 studies, almost 80,000 participants, that suggested the prevalence of osteoporosis in the world's older adults is about 22%. And the prevalence increases with age. In women, it's about 10% in those over 60, 20% in those over 70, 40% in those over 80, and 66% in those over 90. The consequences of osteoporosis, of course, are increased risk of fractures, which can lead to a reduced quality of life, hospitalization, disability, chronic pain, and increased mortality. And only about a third of patients with fractures return to their previous level of function. And the risk of mortality within a year of a hip fracture in those 80 to 89 years of age is 13% in women and 20% in men. So how do plant-based eaters do? Well, while plant-based diets do reduce the risk of most chronic diseases, this does not appear to be the case for osteoporosis and fracture risk. According to a 2023 review, an analysis of 13 studies has shown that vegetarians and vegans are at a higher risk of reducing bone mineral density, thereby increasing the incidence of fractures. And if we look at the 4 most recent studies comparing individuals consuming plant-based diets with omnivores, they include the UK Biobank study, the UK Women's Cohort, Adventist Health Study 2, and EPIC Oxford. And of course, these are all studies with very significant number of participants. And what we see in the UK Biobank and the UK Women's Cohort, they didn't separate vegetarians and vegans, so their results were combined. But in the Adventist Health Study 2, female vegans had a 55% increased risk. The males didn't have an increased risk. And in EPIC Oxford, vegans in general had a 2.3 times higher risk of hip fractures. And I believe the risk of total fractures was about 1.4 times higher. And then with vegetarians, and of course in the first 2 studies, this is vegetarians and vegans combined, we saw about a 50% increased risk in the UK Biobank study and a 33% increased risk in the UK Women's Cohort study. And then in the Adventist Health Study 2, there was a small increased risk of 17% in females, 11% in males. And then in EPIC Oxford, it was a 25% higher risk in vegetarians. And finally, in pescatarians, there wasn't much of a difference in the first 2 UK studies. In the Adventist Health Study 2, there was about a 20% increased risk in females and a 19% decreased risk in males. And in EPIC Oxford, it was a 26% increased risk in pescatarians. And in the UK Biobank study, the absolute risk difference was 3.2 more hip fractures per 1,000 people over 10 years among vegetarians. And the lower BMIs of the vegetarians explained some but not all of the risk difference. And then in the UK Women's Cohort study, the risk wasn't actually increased in vegetarians with a BMI over 23.5, but among the vegetarians, risk of hip fracture was 46% higher in participants with a BMI under 23.5. And then in the Adventist Health Study 2, vegan diets, when supplemented with both calcium and vitamin D, were actually not associated with increased fracture risk. So this was our a bit of a unique finding. And then in Epic Oxford, the absolute risk difference in hip fractures for every 1,000 people over 10 years was almost 3 more hip fractures for pescatarians and vegetarians and almost 15 for vegans. And statistically significant higher risk was only observed in vegans with a BMI under 22.5. And the increased risk was mainly for postmenopausal women. There was a higher risk, the higher risk, although attenuated, remained after adjustment for BMI, calcium, and protein intakes. So what are the possible explanations for the higher risk among the particularly vegan community? Well, there's generally a lower BMI, and that's quite consistent throughout the research. And there tends to be lower intakes of protein, calcium, vitamin D, zinc, and B12, all of which can be associated with reduced bone health. And then there was also less hormone replacement therapy and lower IGF-1 levels, which could add to the explanation. Now, there are, however, many protective aspects of plant-based diets, which we need to appreciate. So higher intake of vegetables and fruits, lower acid load, lower sodium intakes, higher intakes of several bone-building nutrients, including vitamin K, magnesium, potassium, and vitamin C and E, and higher intakes of isoflavones. And if we look at the data on protein intake and hip fractures, there was actually a study of almost 110,000 participants. And this was both from the Nurses' Health Study and Health Professionals Follow-Up Study. And these are individuals that have been followed for more than 3 decades. And there were over 2,700 hip fractures. And they found that for every 10-gram increase in protein intake, risk of hip fractures in both men and women were reduced by 8% when it was dairy protein, 9% for animal protein, but this was only for men, not for women, and 12% for plant protein. So plant protein provided the greatest protection of all. There are many steps we can take towards ensuring strong bones as plant-based eaters. Number 1 is to make sure we get plenty of weight-bearing exercise. And while a lot of experts will say we need 150 minutes per week, I would suggest that going higher is better, and I would aim for 60 minutes a day. And then diet, we want to ensure sufficient calcium and vitamin D, sufficient vegetables and fruits. We want to meet recommended intakes for protein and design the diet to be very nutrient dense so we get optimal intakes of all bone building nutrients. And we might want to include isoflavone-rich soy foods, which can also be protective. And finally, frailty. There was a systematic review of 240 studies from 62 countries and over 1.75 million participants that reported a prevalence of frailty ranging from 12 to 24% in those over 50. And there was another UK cohort of over 2.1 million participants that found that frailty affected 10% of those 50 to 64 and almost 44% of individuals over 65. And what we see in terms of clinical presentation is reduced strength and endurance, reduced physiological functioning, falls, delirium and confusion, and fluctuating disability and weight loss. And the causes are generally malnutrition, physical inactivity, chronic inflammation, social isolation, and multiple medications. So how do plant-based eaters do in terms of frailty? Well, there was actually a systematic review and meta-analysis of 11 cohorts with over 103,000 participants that examined the link between the Mediterranean diet and frailty. And the pooled odds ratio for the risk of frailty was 45% lower, comparing extreme categories of adherence to a mainly plant-based Mediterranean diet. Then another new study, this is the Enrica study from Spain, 1,880 participants over the age of 60 years that assessed the impact of healthy eating on risk of frailty using the plant-based diet index. And those in the upper third of the healthy plant-based diet index, and this is where whole plant foods predominate, had a 57% reduced risk of frailty. And those in the upper third of the unhealthy plant-based diet index, where processed foods predominate, had a 289% higher risk of frailty. And then another study, this one out of the US, over 82,000 women from the Nurses' Health Study, almost 13,000 cases of frailty, found that the HPDI, or the Healthy Plant-Based Diet Index, was associated with a 23% lower risk of frailty for the highest versus lowest quintile. And the UPDI, or the Unhealthy Plant-Based Diet Index, was associated with a 24% higher risk of frailty for the highest versus lowest quintile. And then another study, and again, this is from the Nurses' Health Study, over 85,000 participants, over 13,000 cases of frailty. They compared plant versus animal protein intake, and they found that the highest quintile of plant protein intake was associated with a 14% lower risk of frailty, whereas animal protein intake in the highest quintile was associated with a 7% higher risk of frailty. When 5% of energy from animal protein was replaced with plant protein, the risk of frailty was reduced by 32% when dairy was replaced by plant protein, and by 42% when protein from meat was replaced by plant protein. A higher intake of plant protein, but not animal or dairy protein, was associated with a lower risk of frailty. So why the plant-based advantage? Well, whole food plant-based diets are nutrient dense. They're high in phytochemicals, antioxidants, and fiber. They're low in saturated fat and higher in unsaturated fat. They're low in ultra-processed foods, which adversely affect inflammation and the gut microbiota. But there are some plant-based cautions. We need to ensure reliable sources of B12 and vitamin D. We need to ensure sufficient protein and calories. Nutritional priority number 3 is to avoid malnutrition. There was a 2017 multicellular study that reported that 18% of people over 70 were malnourished and 45% were at risk of malnutrition. A 2021 European review suggested that about 25% of adults over the age of 65 are malnourished. And so some of the signs of malnutrition that we commonly see in older adults are unintentional weight loss, muscle wasting, fatigue, weakness, swelling or fluid retention, especially in hands, feet, and face, cold, papery, thin skin, hair falling out, poor oral health and eye health, bone loss, fractures, constipation, loss of appetite, loss of interest in eating, mood issues, poor concentration, and a weak immune system resulting in increased infections and poor recovery from illness or injury, and of course, increased risk of chronic disease. And the causes of malnutrition are poor quality diets, insufficient intakes of whole plant foods, excessive intakes of highly processed foods, fried foods and fast foods, excessive intakes of red and processed meat, and high intake of sugar-sweetened beverages and added sugars. And there are nutritional shortfalls, of course, calorie and energy deficits, insufficient fiber, insufficient macronutrients, and the ones we see most often are protein and omega-3 fatty acids, a lack of certain micronutrients, including vitamins like B6, B12, and folate, vitamin C, D, E, and K, and minerals like calcium, iron, magnesium, potassium, selenium, and zinc. So how do plant-based eaters fare? Well, overall, they have higher quality diets. In fact, vegan diets are often the highest quality diets in terms of the intake of more vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. They have higher intakes of antioxidants and phytochemicals, more fiber and prebiotics, fewer highly processed foods, less saturated fat, less sodium, fewer environmental contaminants, and fewer products of oxidation. But there is a somewhat greater potential for increased or for insufficient calories. In terms of macronutrients, we do see a greater tendency to have protein intakes below recommended intakes, but for carbohydrates, we see higher intakes in plant-based eaters and higher quality carbohydrates, more from whole foods, fewer added sugars and refined carbohydrates, and higher fiber intakes, more prebiotics. And in terms of fat, we see lower total fat, less saturated fat, higher intakes of polyunsaturated fat, but lower intakes of long-chain omega-3s, EPA, and DHA. And then in terms of micronutrients, we see lower risk of shortfalls in plant-based eaters of nutrients like folate, vitamin C, E, K, potassium, and magnesium, but higher risk for shortfalls of B12, calcium, vitamin D, iodine, selenium, and zinc. So we want to talk a little bit about minimizing risk of malnutrition in plant-based eaters. And we need to recognize that as energy needs of older adults are generally lower and nutrient needs remain the same, or in some cases are even higher, it is important that the diet is nutrient dense. There is just less room for discretionary calories, items that have a lot of calories and few nutrients. So in terms of calories and energy, plant-based diets are less energy dense. They have fewer calories per gram of food. And this, generally results in less overweight and obesity, but it can increase the risk of insufficient energy intake for some individuals. And for those individuals, what they can do to increase caloric density is to eat more higher fat whole foods like nuts, seeds, and avocados, eat more concentrated carbohydrates like grains and starchy vegetables, and concentrated protein sources like legumes, tofu, and veggie meats. They can include some liquid calories, such as nutritious smoothies, and just eat more frequently. And the other thing we can do to ensure nutritional adequacy is to use a well-designed food guide like the vegan plate. And this will help to ensure that you're getting a reasonable amount of foods from each food group and ensuring that the nutrients that may not be provided from whole foods that we have a reliable source of those nutrients as well. So let's look very briefly at macronutrients. In terms of protein, plants are enough. People can build and retain muscle similarly, whether protein comes from plant or animal sources. But plants are less concentrated protein sources, and the digestibility may be a little lower. So we need a greater focus on protein-rich plant foods as we age. And there are a number of reasonable practical strategies for boosting protein. Number one is to include a protein-rich choice with meals and snacks. So things like legumes, legume-based pasta, soy foods like tofu, tempeh, and edamame, nuts and seeds, seitan, veggie meats, and protein-rich non-dairy milks and yogurts, those that would provide 6 or more grams of protein per cup. We may also want to include some lower fiber protein options in the mix to improve digestibility. So things like tofu, soy milk, peanut butter, seitan, and veggie meat provide more highly digestible protein. And then we can limit the intake of added fats as they contain a lot of calories and no protein at all. So for example, just replacing oil with nut and seed butters on our bread, toast, in baked goods, and in our salad dressings. We can also improve protein digestibility by using food preparation methods that reduce anti-nutrients like trypsin inhibitors, tannins, phytates, lectins, and products of the Maillard reaction. And we can reduce these by soaking, cooking, sprouting, fermenting, and yeasting. We can also use food preparation methods that reduce particle size, thereby enhancing digestibility, like blending, pureeing, grinding, and processing. And for omega-3s, can older adults get enough from plants? Yes, they can. We can get enough alpha-linolenic acid from chia, flax, and hemp seeds, and from walnuts. There are some novel sources as well. And then from seed plants, we can get EPA and DHA. Microalgae is the key source of EPA and DHA for fish. And it can also be, we can culture it and put it into supplements and provide EPA and DHA in that form for people who don't consume fish. Macroalgae does provide some EPA, but you would have to eat a lot of it to get enough. Eggs also provide some DHA for people who are consuming ovo-vegetarian diets. And EPA and DHA supplements may be a wise plan for older adults because they tend to be less efficient in converting ALA to EPA and DHA. So microalgae-based supplements are now widely available for plant-based eaters, and typical suggested intakes are 300 to 500 milligrams per day for, or 800 to 1,000 milligrams per day for deficient individuals. And micronutrients, we definitely don't have time to go through them all, but I'll just touch briefly on B12, calcium, and vitamin D. B12 deficiency increases risk of dementia and Alzheimer's, and B12 intakes are low in plant-based diets, but all older adults are at risk for B12 deficiency. 10 to 30% of people over 50 have diminished ability to cleave B12 off of the protein it's bound to in animal products due to lower acid and enzyme production, which means that animal products become unreliable sources of B12 for these individuals. So we want to say don't mess with B12. Everyone over 50 needs to ensure reliable daily sources. And many experts are suggesting 500 to 1,000 micrograms a day for those 65 years of age or more. And we may want to monitor B12 status as well. So what are reliable sources for those 50 plus? B12 fortified foods and supplements. So moving on to calcium, recommended intakes in the UK are 700 milligrams per day for everyone over the age of 19. Now, for many countries, including in the United States and Canada, the recommendations are higher. So in US and Canada, it's 1,000 milligrams up to the age of 50 for females and up to the age of 70 for males, and then 1,200 for females over 50 and males over 70. So meeting recommended intakes means getting familiar with calcium-rich plant foods, low oxalate greens like turnip greens and bok choy and kale and broccoli, for example. Things like almonds and chia seeds, sesame, tahini, and certain legumes like black beans and white beans, especially great northern beans, tofu that's been precipitated with calcium, figs, organic molasses. There are a number of excellent calcium sources in the plant kingdom. And then the other thing we can do is to select some calcium fortified non-dairy milks and other foods with added calcium. Calcium fortified milks typically provide about 300 milligrams of calcium per cup, which is pretty much identical to what cow's milk provides. So adding at least 1 or 2 servings of non-dairy milk along with the other calcium-rich choices that you will typically make, will generally meet the needs of older adults. Vitamin D, the risk of shortfalls is higher among vegans because there are fewer dietary sources, and our ability to produce sufficient vitamin D declines with age. Production decreases about 13% per decade. And of course, vitamin D is critical to bone health, immune function, brain function, and blood glucose regulation. And the recommended intakes, again, are lower in the UK at 10 micrograms for everyone over 19, and then they are in US and Canada. And it's 15 micrograms for those 1 to 70 and 20 micrograms for those over 70. And the main food sources of vitamin D in the general population are eggs, fish, liver, mushrooms that are grown in UV light, and fortified foods like non-dairy and dairy milks and cereals. So you can see there are a lot of foods that are rich sources that are not plant foods. So we have fewer choices eating entirely plant-based diets. Many experts now suggest 1,000 to 2,000 IUs of supplemental vitamin D per day for adults, especially older adults. And vitamin D does raise serum levels to a somewhat greater extent than D2 and maintains higher levels for longer. So this is a reasonable choice, but plant-based vitamin D D3 is widely available, so not an issue. So in summary, plant-based diets are protective for older adults. Plant-based diets are best for reducing risk of chronic disease by a long shot. Well-designed plant-based diets can help to reduce the development of common conditions associated with aging. And plant-based diets can easily be planned to minimize the risk of malnutrition. And I think some of the most compelling reasons to consume a plant-based diet are the benefits that we realize beyond ourselves. A plant-based diet is the most ecologically sustainable diet, and I believe the most ethically justifiable diet. And when we consider the consequences of our food choices, both for ourselves and beyond ourselves. A plant-based diet simply makes sense at every stage of the life cycle. And as older adults, we really value the opportunity to leave a softer footprint and a healthier planet for future generations. And with that, I'll say thank you very much. Some of my books, including Plant-Powered Protein. So that's it, and I'm very happy to take any questions that you might have.
That was absolutely incredible, and I hope you could hear the round of applause, Brenda, from here, from the room.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
No, it's an honor. So I will dive right into the Q&A, and everyone, we're still using Slido for questions, so do pop them in there because we've got about 10 minutes. So I'll kick off, Brenda. So the first question is, what is your view on plant-based protein powders as a therapeutic intervention in older individuals who need to meet a higher protein target, and perhaps that they're not just able to meet that through the diet? What's your view on the protein powders?
I think that they have a role to play. I don't think they're often necessary. I think for most individuals, they can meet their protein requirements with whole foods, which to me is a better option because whole foods provide all of these wonderful, components that come with the whole foods, the fiber and phytochemicals and so on. However, there are some individuals that just really have a challenge meeting needs. And so a protein powder can make a big difference for them. But what I would suggest is that you be very careful in your selection, because we have found that there are contaminants often in protein powders, and not all protein powders are equal. You don't want to be selecting a protein powder that has a lot of added sugars and colors and flavors and so forth. You want to pick a protein powder that's very high quality. Often if you get one that's a mix of plant proteins, then you'll get an even stronger effect, because we want to ensure sufficient leucine. And leucine is one of those amino acids that is really important for muscle maintenance and muscle building. And so just having that mix of proteins can be really helpful. And there are some excellent high quality protein powders available. So it really can be an option and can make sense for some individuals.
That's great to know. Thank you. So one of the upvoted questions is what is, in your opinion, the best form of B12, methylcobalamin or cyanocobalamin? I know there's some confusion, and I see both in the shops regularly. So what's your view on that for exclusively plant-based eaters?
This is one of the most contentious issues among plant-based leaders, because we know there are several of the leaders that say cyanocobalamin because it's more stable. We have more scientific evidence that supports cyanocobalamin. And then there are other leaders that are very well-respected leaders in the plant-based movement that say methyl and adenosylcobalamin are preferred because they're natural. They don't contain any, the cyanide part of the molecule, and they're just safer, and they tend to work in a similar way as cyano. My own opinion is that cyano is much less expensive. So I think it makes sense for the general population, especially those who can't afford to spend as much money on supplements. I believe cyanocobalamin is safe for almost everyone. People with who are smokers or have kidney disease may want to choose methyl or cyano, but for most people, may want to choose methyl, but for most people, cyano is perfectly safe and acceptable. Some people with genetic issues may not convert the cyano appropriately and may need methyl or or adenosine, but generally I think cyano is a reasonable option. Some people, and I think this is a reasonable choice as well, include both. They'll have one supplement of cyano, one of adenosine or methyl, or a combination of the two, and just sort of alternate them, and that may be the best of both worlds.
Fantastic. So as you mentioned, doing things like grinding nuts and things can make that protein more digestible. And since peanuts and peanut butter can be a source of protein, and it might be a good source of protein, especially for older adults with smaller appetites, is there a risk for people eating quite a lot of that about the aflatoxin contamination? Is that something that we should be worried about if we're eating peanuts and peanut butter?
Mm-hmm. That's such a good question. And, I've looked into this in many countries, including in North America. And generally Europe and the UK are even more stringent than North America is. But we have pretty strict regulations regarding levels of aflatoxins in these products. And they're tested when they come into the country. And so I tend to be less concerned about that generally. I might be concerned in some countries that have less stringent regulations. But I do also consider peanuts do tend to be one of the more pesticide-laden crops. They're quite often heavily sprayed. So choosing, organic may be helpful in that regard, but organic does not mean there's no aflatoxins. And I think that's something that people need to be aware of. And to me, it's really simple. When it comes to foods like whether it's soy or peanuts or whatever foods that there may be some issues with, I think the bottom line is we want variety in the diet. And so rather than focusing on, peanuts and peanut butter, have a greater variety of nuts and seeds and nut butters. And then you don't have to worry about that so much. So I think that, I have a mixed nut butter, almond butter, peanut butter, and just vary it up. And I think that's one of the safest things to do.
That's great advice. Thank you. So would you suggest to patients with late-stage chronic conditions who are struggling to meet calorie requirements on a whole food plant-based diet to add some highly calorific, more ultra-processed foods to their diet, things like some plant-based meat alternatives or things like that? What are your views on someone who's in that situation or who's struggling to meet their calorie needs?
Yeah, and I think it's not even just calorie needs, it's also protein needs. And so adding in a veggie meat, for example, definitely concentrated calories, but also very digestible concentrated protein as well. And so I think those foods, and this can't be discounted, there's also an ease or convenience associated with these foods. You have maybe a single senior who just wants simple meals, and popping out a veggie burger and cooking it up is just so easy. And so for many people, I think that these foods can fit into a healthy, balanced plant-based diet, particularly when the majority of our foods are whole plant foods. And then we just have these used more occasionally and maybe having them a couple of times a week. The one thing that is a concern is they do tend to be high in sodium. And so there are some that are not. And so, for example, there's something called soy curls and some of these protein foods that are concentrated protein but don't have all of the added sodium. The other thing, of course, you can do is to compare labels and then choose the lower sodium products. But I think it's not a good plan to say we should never consume these foods. I think these foods are not only good in terms of convenience for seniors and for others, but they also make being vegan or being entirely plant-based a little easier for people. So when your kid is off to Boy Scout camp or whatever, girl Girl Guide camp, and everybody's roasting hot dogs on the fire. Isn't it nice for them to have a hot dog they can roast? Or you're going to a barbecue where everybody's doing burgers, where you can take a burger. I mean, certainly you can make homemade ones, which I do all the time. I have a lentil beet burger. But generally, for a lot of people, just that convenience of being able to take something that looks like what everybody else is having can make being vegan just that much easier.
Couldn't agree more. So just one last question before we wrap up. It can be difficult sometimes with older adults to bring in change. They can be sometimes more reluctant to change their habits and traditions. How can we inspire change in older adults, so patients who might be older in age or family members? What are your top tips there for everyone listening?
Well, my top tips, share, one of the things, I just finished watching this documentary on the blue zones. And I was absolutely blown away by some of the stories there. And they're just so inspiring to see these people who are centenarians and the 105 lady, chopping wood. And these kinds of stories are just so inspiring. But for me, I'm almost 65. My mom is 85. And she lives about 10 minutes from me. And I think her diet has changed a lot since we, moved closer together. Because every time I make a meal, I bring some to her. And so now she eats almost entirely plant-based because it's just so convenient. She's getting food from me that's delicious and prepared with love. And so I think one of the most important things we can do is to share delicious food, and just helping people to taste the foods, it will make a difference. Let them taste a chili made without any meat, or a burger that's been, I just gave my mom, I think, 4 of my lentil beet burgers, and she said, oh, they're just amazing. They're so delicious. And so sharing that kind of food, I think, is just the best way we can do this. Take it when we go to restaurants, bringing them to a place where they can taste some really, exciting plant-based food, some ethnic restaurants where the populations traditionally use a lot of legumes or tofu. These can just open their eyes to how wonderful plant-based foods can really be.
Fantastic. What a positive note to end on. Thank you so much, Brenda, for sharing your wisdom and your incredible knowledge. It's just been a fantastic end to a great day and a great weekend. So thank you again, Brenda, for joining us.
Thanks,
for all the great questions from everyone.
Thank you so much. It was a real privilege to be with you today.
Thank you so much. And do catch the documentary that Brenda Davis just mentioned, Blue Zones, on Netflix by Dan Buettner. It's a fantastic one. And I'm now going to welcome Dr. Shireen Kassam to close the VegMed London 2023. Thank you very much.